Mystery Bible on listeners and watchers on our YouTube channel. You have Joel and Dan as two parts of your fearless trifecta of co-hosts here, and standing in for our third, we have a special guest, Mr. Gary Wayne, with whom most of you are very familiar based on a couple of fantastic and I think earth-shaking books that he has put out, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and aptly named The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2. If you're not familiar with Gary Wayne and his work, you are familiar with this podcast, you'd probably really like his work because he covers a lot of the same kinds of things we talk about. And he does them, he covers these topics with tremendous detail and a whole lot of fascinating information and linguistics. And Gary, I don't know the page counts on your books, but I heard you mention that the audio version you're working on is 60 hours long. So it's got to be in the high 700 or 800s of pages. So you're a consummate expert in many areas, especially when it comes to the Nephilim and the Genesis 6 outlook on the world. And so we're very happy to have you on. You've contributed a tremendous amount to the space, and we owe you a great debt for the amount of thoughtful ideas and perspectives that you have brought into this weird space of trying to understand our Bibles in a biblical worldview that's not a flannel board worldview. So thanks for joining us here at Mystery Babylon.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And so happy to be here and to introduce myself to your audience. And if we do our jobs right, we're going to raise a few eyebrows tonight, which is what we try and do, but in an intellectual way to drive some curiosity, to dig deeper into the Bible and learn about what this world is all about. So yes, my books are not short. Just over 800 pages on book 1 and 760 pages on book 2. I did promise book 2 would be shorter, and it is, but not by a whole lot. So 98 chapters and 84 chapters. And it is, one of the things that I didn't know when I wrote book 1, it's probably too big of a book, but as I got out marketing it and doing media shows and things like that, I learned that, people were starving for information and not just the superficial stuff. They wanted it backed up and they wanted details with it. And so book 1 does that, and book 2 does it in a different way, but targeted for what I found really surprising was a starving for knowledge about the whole Bible from Christians. And they wanted one based on the kind of research I did for book 1 in terms of how deep I go. Can you do that with the Bible? And of course I can, because that's where all of my research sort of comes from. And then in book 1, I just show how it intersects with worldviews, where this one will have worldviews, but how it fits in with the accuracy of the Bible. But if you've not read a book like either one, they're both unique. And if people buy either book, I think they're going to be surprised. But if you're a Christian and you have any sort of doubts, whether or not you come over to the evidence and information I provide, you're going to say, I've never seen somebody go this deep and back it up so much with Scripture.
Well, and I can absolutely concur with that, having spent some quality time with book 1. And it's not just that you go deep and back it up with Scripture. You go deep and you back it up with research and context and ancient language context, and you show you show the layers of reality that are behind these things. And I think that's the way to approach Scripture. I think somewhere along the way, you've become rather native to this ancient Near Eastern way of thinking. And you alluded to it earlier when you said, can we raise some eyebrows and generate some curiosity? Because the more I spend time in the Old Testament, and especially in Genesis, and that requires studying, midrashes and these sorts of things, you realize we Westerners tend to look at Scripture and say, what's the answer? Show me the answer. And that's not really the way the texts were written, and it's not really the way the ancient people approached it. They looked at it as, where's the mystery? Mysteries are revealed by divinity. And what questions should I be asking? And why is this written in a way to draw me into something larger that's going on and make me start thinking a certain way, versus just show me a list of facts that I can adapt and start beating other people about the head and shoulders with them.
Yeah, and even more so is that Israel and the Bible wasn't written outside the influence of the rest of the world. It was an island, sort of allegorically speaking, as Israel would be understood as the earth, and the Gentile nations would be understood allegorically as the sea. And that there's going to be interaction and things done or in context of what's going around Israel all of the time. And in fact, Israel, and even with Christianity, has been subject to the beast empires all throughout the history and will continue to do so through the end time. So there's a relationship there that we need to understand. And to understand the enemy, we should probably know a little bit more about it, because we find a lot of the things that the Bible is talking about is talking about things in polytheist cultures that we need to know a little bit more about. And the Bible, I think, is warning us to that. So, accounts around the world are told from a polytheist lens and their cultural lens. The Bible story of its history is told from a monotheist lens, but they're talking about the same events that were before, whether it's prehistory or history. Where we are today, they're talking about the same things that are going on in the world today. And they both have, and again, when I say both, I put polytheism as one religion because it's one root religion that comes out before the flood and then crosses the flood, and you just get vernacular names for the different gods. So that they also have then, by sort of an extension of that, a very similar kind of understanding of the end time. And what happens in the age of Aquarius, as one version would sort of describe that end time prophecy, and that they just have a different outcome than the monotheist one. They're talking about the same events, but the Bible talks about it through a monotheist lens, and it talks about it more than just through a New Testament lens. It also talks about it through a Hebrew lens of the Old Testament that we also need to sort of understand.
And that's a lot of contortions for the average Western evangelical to do. And part of what your work does is it helps us do those in ways that don't put things too out of joint. So let's start with this broad question that I like to ask and that some people like to answer. And I have a feeling you're going to be very good at it. Gary Wayne, what in the world is going on?
Well, a lot of people are asking that question, and more so. Everybody sort of talks today and ever since the pandemic in a more increased manner is what's going on in the world that it's on such the wrong track. And everybody knows things are out of place. It's not sort of what it was. It's been building to this. So it's not like we haven't seen sort of the smaller sort of waves of those waves before they get bigger. But the best way to put it is we could very well be in the fig tree generation. And if people aren't familiar with the fig tree generation, and a lot of Christians aren't, I would encourage people to get very close to what Jesus talked about in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 17 and 21. And that's his oration for the end time and one specific generation. And that he describes as the fig tree generation. And in prophetic allegory, and I won't go too far deep into the prophetic allegory, but just to sort of tell people what I'm talking about is the fig tree is the southern kingdom, and the vine, as the Old Testament talks about, Israel is the northern kingdom that's been lost. And so when Jesus, just before he's going to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem and then handle the questions from the disciples about, what will be the sign of your coming and the major events of the end time so that we can prepare, because they were thinking it was going to be very, very soon.
Maybe next week.
Yeah, exactly what they were thinking. And so that fig tree is the same fig tree that before he goes to the temple and starts talking about the overturning of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. And before the oration on the end time, he kills a fig tree because it's not bearing fruit anymore. And he's going to leave a sign with that barren fruit tree. It's the sign of Joah, that he's going to be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, not 2 nights as Christianity teaches, because they don't understand the Old Testament festivals and the special Sabbath that follow the Passover.
Yeah. We've talked about
the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
So hey, don't create a new theology, but it's a little more straightforward if you look at how the dates worked.
Yeah, because Jesus isn't going to make a false prophecy. I mean, otherwise we would start to lose some faith. So, but when you decide that you're going to suppress everything about the Jewish people in Israel, for the most part, except for what fits your preconceived conclusion of how you want things to be, those things tend to sort of happen. So the fig tree is representative of the southern kingdom, and it's very sort of relevant and important to understand that he's going to predict the diaspora for rejecting their Messiah. And so when Jesus talks about the fig tree generation and you see its leaves coming out, you know the time is near. And so that's talking about is a return of the southern kingdom to the land of the covenant. And they have to be there for the end time to be fulfilled. And so we don't know how long that generation is. It's certainly, and if you looked at the days of Noah, which I think Christians need to understand more about the days of Noah, about the violence and the godlessness and the source to that and the extent of that, as opposed to just sort of blushing over and saying, okay, well, people are just going to continue as they did. Jesus is referencing the days of Noah in the words of the Old Testament. The days of Noah were 600 years before the flood and 350 years after the flood in Genesis 9:29. And as the Messiah and as the Word of God, the whole Bible is the Word of Jesus, he would not pick a reference with identical words translated from Greek into English and Hebrew into English that would have the same words. And so he's encouraging us to learn what happened because nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again. So whatever happened on both sides of the flood within Noah's generation is going to be coming back in the end time as all things are completed in preparation for the millennium. And so if we just, I'll just finish it with this here. And so if we understand that a generation in the Bible isn't necessarily 950 years in the life of Noah, that you have 40 years that's talked about in the wilderness. You have 70 years as the book of Psalms talks about. But more likely within the days of Noah, the giant's lifetime was limited to 120 years. That's not the commission of Noah because the Bible doesn't make math mistakes. So from the time of the of the birthing of the sons to going on the ark is 100 years from the time frames of 500 and 600 of the age of Noah that were provided. And the language takes it back to making sure that the counterfeit immortal spirit wasn't going to have a hybrid immortal body that was going to continue with the giants, so that all the names that were written in the book of life from before creation will have a chance to have their names left in and not blotted out. So God will intercede at certain times to make sure that enough time is permitted for all the names to have a chance to make their choice or not. So that fig tree generation is likely going to start, whether it's likely 120 years or 70 years based on if it is this fig tree generation versus the 40, because the two main points of our generation would be 1947 with the Declaration of Israel's independence. The war was 1948 versus taking of Jerusalem. And I would tend more towards the taking of Jerusalem because Jerusalem is the epicenter of end time prophecy. So they have to be in control of it. So if there is a start to that generation, I would say it's there. And if that's what's going on, then what is going wrong in the world is we're in what they call the birthing sorrows or the birth pangs. And we're seeing these catastrophes start to happen. They include, if people aren't familiar with the birth sorrows, are earthquakes, which are getting stronger continually over the last 30 years and more often. You have pestilence, that's part of it. And of course, we went through a large pestilence and pandemic, which would be associated with that, and wars and rumors of war. But look for those to get stronger and start working together, and look for them all to be contrived. Because this is not God's judgment on us. This is what we are doing to ourselves. And, and the whole world would be destroyed by fire, as it would have been from before the flood, except God brought the flood to permit a restart for the reasons I mentioned earlier about the book of life. And that unless Jesus were not to step in in the year of the Lord's wrath. And at the time of Armageddon, no flesh would be destroyed. And according to 2 Peter 3, the destruction of the end is by fire, just as it was at some unknown time in the beginning.
Well, that's no less than no less than I expected as a really thoughtful and thought-provoking answer to a very wide-ranging question. I wonder one of the things we like to do here at Mystery Bible On is kind of just provide the opportunity to explore the space a little bit with the grace that we're not trying to be right about everything. We're not trying to tell everybody it's going to be this or it's going to be that or it's going to be at this time, that time, but kind of give some speculative ideas on here's some things to be paying attention to. Here's the kinds of things to be looking out for. And you talked about pestilence and earthquake and war and rumors of war. And one of the things that you mentioned that I think is particularly helpful is that they're contrived, which is an interesting detail because we hear about the former, but we don't hear about the contrivance a lot. What else do you think is something that, and I also want to put this in the perspective of, we have an audience, some of whom are, neck deep in the kinds of material that you're talking about. And then we have a lot of people coming in that are for the first time starting to pay attention to some things that they've never paid attention to. They're not deeply familiar with scripture. They're getting a sense of, it seems like this book says some things that might be relevant to today. So I wonder if you can give people a few things or some ideas to kind of hang their hats on looking forward that they really need to tuck in the back of their mind and file away for future reference.
So when you see these things, know that we're getting closer and closer, right? So look for the beginning thing is to look for these birthing sorrows to get stronger. So we're going to have more pestilence and they're going to get worse as they go. And they're going to be created in either through a biological weapon that's done or how the last pestilence was seemingly designed to maybe not get out of a lab, but found its way out of the lab. I mean, I won't go to, exactly how, but the more the information comes out, we see more of the cover-up on that it could not have been a natural mutation. And it's absolutely amazing that they would cover this up. But if they want people to prepare for global government and the global religion that will come first, because it will be required, then they have to cattle herd us into a specific direction. They have to create the catastrophes, create the problem, provide the solution, which actually makes it worse. It's the typical sort of thing that they do. And so their answer if it didn't get them all the way where they wanted to go on the first one, then they double down. It's always, we didn't do enough, or we didn't introduce it the right way. So, and you have to have that ability, if you're going to do from a scriptural perspective, what we're warned of is watch out for the false prophets that are coming. And the false prophets will make the way for Babylon, which is known in several sort of compartments, one of them being a universal religion. But it's more than that. We should understand it in its entirety. But from the glue that's going to bring about the world government, it's going to be the rise of the religion, and it takes the false prophets, and they need to be able to predict catastrophes to scare people into their religion and have it happen on time. And we're seeing some of that as it comes out in some of the different sort of apparitions. And we're starting to see apparitions not just of Mary, but of Isis and other mother goddesses around the world. But they have a similar story. They have a similar description and described usually like the woman in Revelation 12. Not that we should rely on that for what they're saying. That's part of the deception. There is a special sign, but it's not connected to Mary or Isis. So don't get deceived into that. But one in particular that is very insightful, and I also understand Lourdes and Fatima is part of that series of Mary apparitions. But Medjugorje in the former Yugoslavia was very important in the 90s, where 6 children were indoctrinated in by a Mary apparition. and they have a certain date that they'll take their prophecy of catastrophe to a Catholic priest who will announce it to the world. And they have specific dates already planned to come out on each of these 10 catastrophic prophecies. And that the message will be convert to the true religion or we're going to be destroyed from the face of the earth.
What do you think that true religion is going to look like?
I think it's very well described in Revelation 12 as Babylon, who rides the beast empires and holds the reins and controls them. So just as the religion of the beast empires was a daughter of Babylon, this will be the mother religion of Babylon, the true ancient religion come home, versus the one that branched out around the world and into the different beast nations. It is the religion that was originally created by Enoch, son of Cain. And for Christians who aren't aware that there are two Enochs in the genealogies, one of the Cain line, one of the Seth line, understand that because the spurious forces conflate the two. Yeah. And that's also part of the deceptions. And so that is a religion that was created out of the knowledge that the Masons and the ancient Masons said came from Adam, that he learned from God to manage this huge agrarian facility from the Nile to the Euphrates River, from Mount Hermon to the Southern Sea of Aqaba and the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, so that people understand the vastness of the area, where he's raising multiple kinds of animals in large herds, and he's growing crops everywhere. There are orchards everywhere, and there's only one of them, until God relents and says, well, maybe it's too much. I'm going to give you one partner female to help this manage. So he had to have knowledge, as the Masonic sort of understanding of knowledge of the stars, knowledge of engineering, mathematics, all sorts of things that was taught to him, that was passed on to Cain, passed on to his son Enoch, who puts it into the 7 sacred sciences that we know as the 7 liberal arts today, not to honor the God of the Bible, but to lead people away from God, to discredit God, dismiss God, not give him credit for anything, and to honor the pantheon of gods that he's going to accept. And this is going to be the start of mysticism, because it's mysticism is a knowledge cult, and that this knowledge is going to be developed, and it can't go to the Sethites. Can't go to the mundane. It can only go to the nobility elite that they're going to set up. And this knowledge merges with the knowledge from the angels, the fallen angels, and they receives angelic technology to take it to a level of knowledge that we don't have today. We're only catching up.
So you're talking fundamentally about extraterrestrial technology.
No, I'm talking fallen angelic technology,
well,
that the alien
I'm using the very broadest definition of extraterrestrial, okay. Not people. Okay, it's not coming from people.
Yeah, well, it's a combination of the knowledge, right? Yeah. It's on steroids. So, and this is the knowledge that is going to create a level of violence we can't imagine. And so, yes, the giants were created. Yes, they usurped all of the kingships and the civilizations around the world. Yes, they had that Enochian mysticism, as I like to call it, as that original pantheon and religion. But they developed the arts of war. And according to the book of Enoch, is that Azazel taught not only the craft, but all of the arts. So of making weapons, of doing martial arts, of strategy. And so angelic technology that we're just catching up to would imply that this would have the ability to destroy the world by fire if permitted to play out. But God brings the flood to prevent that. And they had the technology to corrupt the whole earth. That's the Hebrew word shakath. It means to decay, to pervert, to ruin, to destroy. That they destroyed the natural genomes of plants and the DNA of animals and of humans through interbreeding and other DNA manipulation. According to polytheists, they did all sorts of chimera-type animals that we use that term of to honor that history in science today, where it comes from. And this knowledge starts to make sense of God calling the 8 to the ark, to make the ark, and then all the animals, because he knew which representatives or kinds within the species that were still pure and not corrupted to restart the earth afterwards. So it starts to make a lot of sense of where that sort of knowledge comes from. And so when we look at the knowledge that is now going to cross the flood, and we can talk a little bit about that if you like, but this is the knowledge that's on steroids that was taught to Adam in Eden. And so this is the knowledge that we should start to recognize that we're being sped up on, just as it was in the time of Noah, that you have the giants being created, and then this rapid advancement of technology to completely destroy the earth. So when you read what the violence and the godlessness Jesus is talking about in the days of Noah, the violence comes from the giants. The times where the whole earth was being corrupted in terms of plants and DNA manipulation. And the godlessness was forced imposed religion on the whole world by the demigod giant kings who controlled the earth at that point. And so the religion that crosses the flood begins at Babel through, according again to Polychronicon and the history of the Gnostics and the Masons, is that fellow by the name of Harmine or Hermes, which is part of the Trismegistus, finds the pillar that floated versus the one that would survive fire, and they didn't know which one was coming by the inference there. So they did a pillar of each that showed the direction to all of the knowledge of the antediluvians that Enoch had written into 36,525 books stacked on 9 vaults, buried below the earth underneath the Great Pyramid, which was used to build the pyramid from his technology. Again, according to the Freemasons, he takes that knowledge to Nimrod and uses that knowledge, and we don't get the explanation where the knowledge Nimrod gets to build Babel City and Babel Tower, and whatever technology that was there that was Nimrod was planning for it, and or what made Nimrod become a mighty one, because he wasn't born one. So there's an inference of knowledge there, and he is crowned as the Grand Master after the flood, first Grand Master of ancient royal masonry after the flood, and writes the first constitution, and he imposes this Enochian mysticism at Babel. And of course, Babylon, as it's described and understanding it as a religion, is a mystery religion, an initiatory religion, as all mystical religions are around the world. They have the same gods, just different vernacular names for the local cultures for the top pantheon. And each of the nations will have some other gods because there are gods assigned to every nation around the earth, both before and after the flood, and numbered by the 70 sons of Adam and the 70 patriarchs numbered in Genesis 10 and First Chronicles, and numbered by the 70 sons born in to Jacob as part of the dual prophecy there meant for a future time as in the millennial reign. And even though we don't get 70 sons listed by Genesis of all of his sons, we know from Deuteronomy 32 that he would have had 70 sons by the application of the scripture. So you have different gods ruling around, but at a lower level on the angelic hierarchy. So we do get this council of the gods talked about in the Bible in Psalms 82 and Deuteronomy 32, where all the land was split up to the sons of Israel. In book 2, I give you the compounded word of Israel. It's not talking specifically about Israel that would be out of place before the flood, but it's talking about the sons of Israel. It says so in the Hebrew. It would be sons Sarah El as the compound word, which is sons of the ruling God Almighty.
So, quick question.
Go for it, Dan.
Well, not a quick question, and it won't be a quick answer, I don't think. But so you're saying there's all this, the information that is technology beyond where we have now. So are you saying that this information is still out there and is being protected within these groups that have the knowledge, or is it more that there's people who are accessing things they shouldn't be accessing to continually get more information?
Both.
Okay, so,
It's a quick
so
answer.
both.
Right?
So that leads to two other questions. So the both, I think I've heard you talk about the occult roots that the Nazis used.
Yep.
So that would be one way. And then I've also heard you talk about the Nephilim roots of the royal families.
Mm-hmm.
And so is that basically the two methods?
That's the same way. So if you understand secret societies, you'll understand that the top levels are all royal bloodlines, and the lower levels are all more diluted bloodlines. So it's the same. And as you get into the adept level, they're communicating with fallen angels, demons. You know, they call them a whole bunch of different things. The celestial white masters, the great white, what do they call it? The great white, doesn't matter. There's a white name that goes along with it. It could be aliens, could be spirit guides. It's all that hierarchy of the fallen ones that includes the invisible ones that are the spirit angels and their offspring that they produced both before and after the flood to run the visible world. So just as we're told in the New Testament that we're fighting both visible ones and invisible ones, not just flesh and blood, and that's kind of a poor translation in the KJV. It should be sort of talked about as we don't fight just flesh and blood, but also these principalities and angels that are in high places and the dark forces of the world. So it's both that we fight. And the ones on the earth are doing the bidding of the fallen angels and the demons. And demons are disembodied spirits of the giants. Won't go into a lot of detail on that unless you want me to get into that.
We've covered that.
Yeah. And that the fallen angels do that because they know the power of El Elyon, God Most High. So they want to destroy humankind so that we were, in the beginning, so that we wouldn't reach our destiny. And really goes to our raison d'etre that the Adamites were created as the resolution to the Angelic rebellion, played out through free choice on a time to fulfill all the names in the Book of Life, but that this I kind of lost my train of thought on where I was there, so I'm trying to bring that back. If I can come
so
back.
You were talking about the mystery schools and the bloodlines and the way the knowledge is moved between the bloodlines. And
right.
So I just want to clarify for our listeners, because again, some are very familiar with this, and some are their heads are spinning and they're going, "What is he trying to say?" What you're describing is that the Earth operates on authority structures.
Yes.
And when it comes to those very earthly authority structures, you have an intermingling between humans, and specifically humans of specific bloodlines, and non-human things that some people would call aliens or extraterrestrials, but more correctly are unclean spirits or spirits from disembodied Nephilim, all the way back to much higher spirits of fallen angels. And that in that you have this empowering of a proxy rulership on Earth, where there's a control level that's working from the top down, and you're pointing out that Paul seems to be very aware of this, and that's why he's pointing these things out.
Yes, and so have they been developing knowledge? A lot of it has been lost in Babel. They've been preserving it. They've been trying to develop it. But as we get closer to the end time, now there's more interaction. So to bring that back to the World War II analogy, the Nazis developed things that they had no capabilities of doing in such a short period of time. They had no army. They were bankrupt when Hitler took over. And in 1933, set up the Reichschurch, which was basically a prototype for the end time religion. It's an Arian, Ariosophy, as they called it. So theosophy was big back then. And this has the Arian and real overlay on it. And they called it Ariosophy. So mysticism. And that they developed things like the Panzer and Tiger tanks that we still use today as the model out of nowhere. They developed the jet engine. They developed the rocket engine. They developed missile capability to target it. They developed a single wing. They developed this what they thought to be an interdimensional thing with this bell-shaped thing that, sort of disappeared from public knowledge. Mm-hmm. And what they said was that they got that knowledge from talking from the adept level, because Masonic societies were used to bring about the Nazis in conjunction with the mystical religion. It went rogue on them, yes, but it was still utilized to come about so they could take down communism that was also started by social masonry to bring down a certain bloodline, the Putyanin bloodline, or the junior offshoot of the Putyanin bloodline, the Romanovs, through intermarriage. And so you have this knowledge that is presented to them that had they been able to produce it in numbers, they would have won World War II. Or if they had maintained access to heavy water, they were ahead on the atomic bomb. And they had no capability of doing this. And they say that wasn't our knowledge, and that they were communicating with the celestial White Brotherhood. That's the name I was looking for, and other things. And so, at the Nuremberg trials, they didn't even let them bring the mystical part of their religion out for the trials because they didn't want them to plead insanity.
Do you speculate that the White Brotherhood has anything to do with the benevolent space brothers that kind of came about in the 60s of these tall Nordics, or what some people call the tall whites, and that they call them our brother race out there? Do you think that there's some crossover of these wise beings that seem to be very kind and benevolent, but also seem to have an agenda?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the alien mythos, but if we understand that they created other types of beings other than Nephilim and Rephaim after the flood, then we start to understand that in the New Testament, we're told about the elementals, not just the smallest parts of the universe, but elementals that keep us as slaves in this world, and that elementals is a key polytheist doctrine, and they make up the lowest level of the visible ones. And so within that, you have ugly ones, like trolls and dwarves and gnomes, and you have good-looking ones, like Tinkerbell or Fairy Queen or something like that, and mischievous ones like leprechauns. And that these are creatures that we see like in Lord of the Rings, which is the assembly of the giants, both before and after the flood at Nippur, or at Mount Hermon, where we talked about the Council of the Baalim and the Council of El before the flood, with the Council of the Titanu after the flood, and probably named the same thing before, according to the Ugaritic texts. And so you have beings that are being represented in this world in Lord of the Rings. And so you have like dwarves that are living in the mountains that made the weapons for the giants in that belief system. And that the gnomes were the ones who held the technology for the giants and held the genealogies. And they had UAPs or UFOs that would come through portals. And they have that even after the flood. And these are called the gray gnomes. And they have the same description as the grays in the alien mythos, and do the same type of kidnapping and experimentation as the grays do. In the Lord of the Rings, you have the white elves. The white elves are a larger being than the little people, and the elves are represented in the little people as dark elves versus the white elves. So in the Lord of the Rings, you get this pale, tall, white elf. That is a representation or an allegory for the Tuatha De Danann, both before and after the flood, who are pale-skinned, either blonde-haired and blue-eyed, or red-haired and hazel eyes. And typically in Lord of the Rings, it's the blonde hair and blue eyes one, because Tolkien is talking about the Norse Tuatha De Danann. The assembly of the Ditanu is the assembly of the Tuatha De Danann. They're known by a lot of different names around the world, from the Sede or the Shay or the C, however you want to pronounce that. The Shay. There's several different ways to pronounce that, just as Tuatha Danann, the Danawa, also known in the Middle East as the tribe or the Tuatha Danu, as being the tribe of Anu. And notice you have an Anu on the Titanu, and in the old knowledge of linguistics, the D and the T were sort of interchangeable. So this, you could have had that as Dedan as it shows up in Hebrew, or it could be Titan as it shows up in Greek, knowing that you have titans of heaven and the titans of the earth that they created as their spurious offspring, the demigods, people like Hercules and Perseus and giants like that. And these are all talking about the same sort of types of beings. So, these white elves are the Tuatha De Danann, who are known as the fairy folk, the fair folk, and they were giants.
Yeah.
The Fae, yes. So that's that representation of the giants in The Lord of the Rings. And what's interesting as well, you have at the end of The Lord of the Rings, you have all of these different creatures sailing off on a boat on the water. And that's a representation, because it's the time of man now, and that's a representation of the flood, and that all these creatures sort of disappear or are destroyed or are driven to another portal, however you want to
very
interpret.
Similar to the Narnia ending as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, they were best buds. They were to the same Inkling Rosicrucian Society. They're both royales, and I have a 6-part series on Tolkien and Lewis that I that's verified at no charge, and I trace in parts 5 and 6 each of their royal bloodlines, because there's no way you could have a non-Masonic person or adept in a Rosicrucian society if you understand the hierarchical order of the Thelemic tree. It's just not probable or likely. And so they already had knowledge as royales that are initiated from childhood. They were far beyond adept level. In fact, as a royale, you don't take an adept title until you're somewhere between 25 and 30 years old. So they're still at university. They're not of that age, but yet they're in this Rosicrucian-sponsored society. They're there to learn the writing craft, and they take their knowledge of the occult and write terrific literature and fantasy tales in their mythopoetic style. But it's got all of their belief systems, their history, and their genealogies embedded into the characters, places, and allegories that they lay throughout the Bible. It's the classic fairy tale concept. In fact, they called the Bible a fairy tale, and they're talking about that same sort of writing style when they make that reference.
And the difference is, when they say fairy tale, they believe what they're saying. Meaning, when we say fairy tale, we mean, oh, it's nothing. When they say fairy tale, they're talking about something of substance with actual history to it. So it's almost a backwards compliment when they say, oh, it's a fairy tale. To them, that means it's true. Yeah. And it's a piece of a mythos. What do you think about any speculation on George MacDonald?
Well, he was one of the mentors, right? And he was, those building the building blocks to this whole writing style. And he wrote, very famous occult books. So, part of the same sort of group. And it's an MO to have writing societies and entertainment designed to keep us swimming in polytheism. Yeah.
We just have podcasts. It's a lot. You got to crank it out a lot faster these days.
Yeah.
So where do you speculate that we, and again, exploring the space, it's speculation. Where do you think we're seeing this today? Do you think that there are, I'll get more specific. Do you think there are elements of that sort of influence in the, the Marvel movies, the stuff that Hollywood's cranking out about, extra human beings and species? And we did a whole episode on, they had a movie called The Eternals, which is just absolutely rooted in ancient mythology down to, and then you get to, what's the one, with the blue people going through the portal and going into the alternative world, and they have the tree of life, and Jay just came up with another one. Anyway.
Avatar,
that's what I'm trying to get at. And you look at what they're doing there, and they're taking the word, like the source of everything, instead of Yahweh, it's Awa. They're just flipping words around and tying things in. Is that just clever writing, or do you think they're trying to disclose something?
Oh, they're doing that same style of writing. And it's there to prepare people for what they're going to be introducing at a specific period of time. So it's filled with their religious doctrine. And not that some of it isn't true. It's just what they do with their belief system that we have to be careful of. So if you take that word avatar, well, that's a Hindu Buddhist concept.
It's pretty loaded. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's two terms that you need to understand. They only tell us one. There's an avatar, and then there's an avatara. So the avatar in Eastern religions would be like Vishnu or Shiva, who use that type of thing quite often. I think Vishnu avatared 16 times. One of them was with Buddha to provide him additional knowledge. So what an avatar does, as an angelic being, enters into the body in a symbiotic relationship versus a possessing by a demon spirit in not a symbiotic relationship, and provides, in this case for Buddha, additional wisdom, traditionally other types of powers. It depends on the avatar and avatara. So if we understand biblically that, can this happen or can't it happen? Should be something we should be aware of or not? We should understand what Satan did. Satan entered into Judas to give him the courage to continue to betray Jesus to the end. And so we know biblically that you can have an avatar and an avatara. You might say the same thing with the Holy Spirit. Now, everything they do is a counterfeit of what the tripart nature of God would do. And so they like to corrupt everything. And you might even speculate that perhaps, Satan entered into the Nahash, or the serpent, to deceive Eve. But it doesn't have to be. He could have just coached him to do it, so they wouldn't have any blood on his hands. But again, I mean, he did it to help Judas. So I can't say for sure he would have avatared into the hash as his avatar to do it, but it seems likely. And people say, well, no, it's Satan is the serpent. He did it. Well, yes, he was in Eden, but he wasn't in Eden in his seraphic form, which we name like the mysticism in Judaism, the Kabbalah, or other forms like from the Essenes would understand him as Samael, as in his seraphic form. Ezekiel 28 says he was in cherubim, but it was in Eden, but in his cherubim form. So he wasn't there as his serpent, and he had many different formats. He had different kinds of angelic natures, including the morning star order, as Hail El Ben Shakar in Isaiah 14:12 talks about. And it means brightness and boastful and a whole bunch of different words. It comes actually from two different source words. And it's not Lucifer. That's an Italian word inserted into the English language for a Hebrew word. Hail El ends in El. It is an angelic name. So what would the name of the cherubim title and presence in Eden might be? Well, Book of Enoch talks about the angel in Eden as Gadrael. And if you take that back to Hebrew, it means wall of God or God's wall. So you get sort of a consistency, different title, different name. And it was a standard understanding that not only kings, but also gods could have up to 7 names, maybe more.
So, Gary, one more. I want to go back to something you alluded to earlier about the royal families and the bloodlines and Nephilim roots. If you could just describe that a little more so people know what it is you're talking about when you say that. And talk about an eyebrow raising type comment is to say like modern day royals could trace their roots back. Yeah.
So I'll start off with King Charles III. And when he was still Prince Charles, he's on record, and I have the links to that if people want to get a hold of me, that he said he takes his genealogies back in part because he has scion or a noble grafting of royal bloodlines into his bloodline. He takes his bloodlines back to Vlad the Impaler. which was a classic noble Celt, a fair folk. He was large, he had red hair, he had pale skin, hazel eyes, light condition, commonly known as Dracula, which means son of a dragon. A seraphim angel is a dragon angel, serpent-faced, and rooted in Greek draconta, meaning watcher or watcher angel. So anyways, I digress. And so he keeps
and
track
just for
of...
people who don't know, Vlad the Impaler was not a nice guy.
Oh, no, he was an awful guy.
He earned his nickname.
Yeah, and based on and the character in an allegory that Dracula by Bram Stoker was based on, right? And what's interesting about Vlad the Impaler, both his father and both Vlad and his father, also named Vlad, they took their genealogies back to the Scythians of the Tuatha De Danann. And that it went all the way back to a tribe of Hercules, the Agrathi. And of course, Hercules, after the flood, is the son of Alchemy, his mother, a human female, and Zeus. And they had a Herculides bloodline. So you have I want to lay that down as a premise as how we understand that today. So the Royals keep all of their genealogies back into the mists of time, back to a specific patriarchal Nephilim, and maybe if they're grafted in bloodlines, several. And that they also keep those genealogies that would go back by inference to a specific celestial mafia godfather, as I like to call him, or a Nephilim, a fallen one. And so that level of ennobleness and pureness will show where they fit in the overall royal culture around the world. And they created heraldry to reflect that. So they put angelic beings in their coats of arms. And so then they used to put it on a standard in older times, that then when they rode on horses into other nations, they would take their standard with their coat of arms, and the royals there would know instantly who they are in terms of the taciturn information that's being passed on. So you have the royals as believing they have the divine right to rule. They're the spurious offspring of fallen angels and gods. And they receive their authority from the assembly of the gods, as we've talked about. And King James was the one, probably the most famous for expressing that. And of course, he has the unicorn and the lion on his coat of arms. And of course, you have Rem, which means wild bull in the KJV, the mighty Gabor Prince James, as I would take the meaning of mighty there, back to the word Gabor, which described giants. And unicorn was substituted for a wild bull, reflective of building his empire and in relationship and passages to Mount Hermon. So let's say with Ephraim, where they were going to gore the world around with its horn around the world, that's a unicorn there. And it should be a wild bull. Could be a single horn wild bull, but it's not this horse that we would sort of associate it with as a unicorn, right? And so
we get this weird single horn apocalyptic concept a lot as well, where this horn shows up that is in these beastly beings.
Well, the Antichrist is the little horn that grows amongst the 10 in Daniel 7, and also the little horn on the Greek Daniel 8 end-time prophetic empire. So yes, that unicorn fits perfectly into an Antichrist wannabe type of play using the Bible. So when we look at what the royals are doing, is they're just using language in plain sight to say that they're superior to humans, and that they come from the Nephilim, who usurped the thrones and the governments before the flood and enslaved humankind and tried to wipe them from the face of the earth, which they were created to do for their fathers. And then again, after the flood, that they're created, only this time there's something a little bit different about the giants with the Rephaim, as the terrible ones that they're called in Ezekiel 32, which is Erit or Eritim, as the terrible ones that did terrible things while they were on earth and were slain, and are now shown in the sides of the pit prison, along with the strong, the Royale, the angels that are also there, are speaking to another Royale, Pharaoh Raphaim, a terrible one. You have an understanding that these terrible ones, these royales, have this long-lasting dynastic bloodline that is going to create not only the beast empires, but the whole noble elite around the world. So that word royale goes back to Old French roi for king and al for an angel, and back to Latin from regus, and words like that from the Latin, and then back to Indo-Aryan for rule or ruler, which was the Nephilim and the Rephaim language. And there's different variations of the Indo-Aryan, but it's the same language. And so the Rephaim that are created after the flood, they have a fertility issue, as they're described in the definition of the terrible ones in Hebrew, that they have a fertility issue or are childless or something is different, whereas the Nephilim before the flood could produce in great numbers and were larger and larger gifts. So something's a little bit less significant about the post-Diluvian giants, but giants nonetheless. Just as Gilgamesh is recorded as 19 feet tall and 7 feet wide, Og would have been on a 2-to-1 height ratio at using his bed at 9 cubits would be, as a king of Edrei and Ashtaroth. A royal cubit of 21 inches would make that bed 16 feet wide, and 4 cubits wide is 7 feet wide. So he'd be 5 to 6 feet wide, and he would have been 12 to 14 feet tall. So we're still talking big. We're just not talking as big as what the original Nephilim would have been. They usurped the kingships and the priesthood all around the world, just like they did before the flood, and they kept these genealogies. So I use a term in book 1 as that they like to call themselves as Rex Deus or Rex Deus, which means kings of God, just as Royale means kings of God. And Royale were understood as a superior bloodline as you take that meaning back in its etymology, just as they looked at themselves as demigods, part angel and part human. But what happens is that they have an inability to produce females after the flood, which is going to present a problem that they're going to go extinct. And one of the reasons why they like to use pure blood matriarchal or female queens to start a new dynasty. And I cover that off in book 1, and I add to it in book 2 as well. So when you see a marriage in Genesis 36, for example, you have Esau, who's the brother of Jacob, whose name changes to Israel, of course, to produce the 12 tribes. He lost all of the blessings and the inheritance and the Messianic promise to his little brother. I mean, twins, but he was the first one out. And so normally he would have inherited that. Well, what he does, he marries in one of the wives a person named by the name of Oholibama. And she is the daughter of Anna, son of Seir in Genesis 36. And Seir is a Horim. He's a giant. And so you have this hybrid race that is going on to create a new dynasty, but not through through the female of Anna's daughter. And so you also have Eliphaz, the son of Esau, who's going to marry Timnah, who is the daughter of Seir, the Horim again. So he creates the Amalekite race with a pure blood fairy queen, and they're called dukes, Hebrew aleph, which the occult takes fairy, elf, elven, all those types of words back to in part of the allegory. And the tribes of Edom are going to intermarry with famous dynasties like the Mitanni and the Kassites and others into other Indo-Aryans as they take their genealogies back. So understand that biblically we get a transition that's documented as an addition to the Table of Nations in Genesis 36 to create hybrid Amalekites in this case, versus the giants that are Amalekites, shown in Genesis 14 a few hundred years earlier in the War of Giants. So that can't be the start of the name. They take that name eponymously, and then they move to Petra, and they live amongst the Amalekite giants. But we see this hybrid human and giant race beginning. It's the necessity to bring in human bloodlines. In this case, they wanted significant human bloodlines, Abrahamic bloodlines, to ennoble this new type of sort of dynasty. And just as Nimrod would have intermarried with giants or female angels to create bloodlines in Mesopotamia after Babel. And then we have another example of that hybrid nature showing up in Genesis 10 and First Chronicles, where you have the Canaanite nations. So 3 of the patriarchs are listed in the 70 there as Canaan, Heth, and Sidon. They're named. They start people that have tribes eponymously named after the patriarch. But the other 9, they don't have a patriarch. And you got the Amorites, you have the Jebusites, you have the Hivites, you have all 9 of them, no patriarch. They're the only ones in the whole table of nations that doesn't have a patriarch. So, and then you have this other example where it's an addition that's added in later, but not part of the table of nations. This maybe give us a hint at what's going on, where you have intermarriage between humans and giants. So we have a tribe of giants in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants, and then in the land that God is awarding Abraham between the Nile and the Euphrates, the same location as Eden is at. Most people don't make that sort of connection. As God's land, of the land preserved amongst himself and the other sons of Israel, as we've talked about previous in the show, or the gods, and that you have a fellow by the name of Rapha, which is the root word for Rephaim. Rephaim is the male plural again. And so we have a tribe of the Rephaim in Genesis 14 and a tribe of Rephaim in Genesis 15, along with other ones like the triple K there that don't have patriarchs, that go back to the table of nations and also unexplained. And that's telling us that if it's a Rephaim patriarch, they're not going to be listed in the table of nations. And that's why the Amorites don't have it. So we have another example of that with Arba. If people aren't familiar with Arba, that's the name that Hebron was named before it was changed to Hebron. It was called Kiriath Arba, or the city of Arba. And Arba in the book of Joshua is the patriarch for the Anakim, who in Deuteronomy 2 are described as giants, Rapha. Yeah. And Horim are described as giants there, Rapha, right? And in the singular, which is important in some cases. So we have another example of a Rephaim patriarch not listed in the table of nations. So if we start to look at those 9s, you could look at perhaps looking for a Rephaim patriarch that married a daughter of Canaan, or a daughter of Heth, or a daughter of Sidon, to create these hybrids so that the giants wouldn't go extinct. And so in book 2, I'll take those patriarchless nations and trace them back to a specific Rephaim patriarch through the Bible.
Well, it's a powerful connections that you're making, and the fact that you can tie it to some of the things that we're seeing modern day makes it particularly interesting. I want to go back to some of what you were discussing about. Well,
just before you go there, and make one more sort of thing, that they continue to intermarry so much that if we look at World War I, look at it as an interfamily squabble of cousins. They were that closely intermarried, from the royal family in Moscow with the Romanovs to Germany and the Kaiser Wilhelm, and the Windsors, Hanovers from Germany, with the Anjou, the Habsburgs, even the Bourbon in Spain. They were all intermarried because they wanted to keep those bloodlines as pure as possible.
So how much do you think they know why it is they're doing that? Like, are they just following the tradition or the royal rules that were set up? Or do you think these people actually know how deep that runs and how far
they
back
know
it goes?
they have the history. They believe they are the descendants of their genealogy that they trace back, and they're trying to bring about the end time, and they would like to do it before the ordained time, and they want that showdown with God because they've been deceived by their masters that they have a chance to win.
Oh, there's a lot there. So if you had to speculate, how many people alive today in the current generation do you think are intentionally, actively in a well-informed place, understanding what's going? There's obviously a movement towards a consolidation of power. I don't think anybody can really argue with that. There's obviously a globalism going on. There's obviously some sort of psychopathic intelligence behind it that's very intent on keeping the great unwashed masses divided and arguing about stuff that they really don't care about. There's obviously an extraction of wealth and a consolidation of wealth and control and power going on. And so, and I imagine there's a lot of very useful puns along there, but when we start zooming out and stepping back into Council of Foreign Relations and some of these very interesting inner circles that seem to be going on, do you think it's a very, very small group? Do you think this is relatively widespread? What do you speculate there?
Well, what we're more familiar with would be the Western organizational structure. But understand, in other parts of the world, they have a separate organizational structure. So when you hear the 13 families, that's the 13 families that we would understand it as the Western bloodlines. Doesn't mean there might not be another 13 families of bloodlines around the world. For example, or let's say a reemergence of the Shah dynasty bloodlines from the dragon creator gods, from the sons of heaven, because they have the same story. Once it was taken down by the virus that the Western bloodlines launched on China, Germany, and Russia, with something they called social masonry that created communism and national socialism to eliminate rival bloodlines. That family bloodline comes down in China in two main forms, and one particular that's important is the Western bloodline, but the bloodlines of the Lees spelt in several different ways, whether it's Lee in English or Li or whatever the different transliterations are, and or Xi. So the Shah dynasties was XIA, and Xi is a family name from the Shah dynasty, and we have a Xi that is back on the leadership of China and wants to be there for life, and would not be surprised if he's dynastically orientated, that would like to seemingly have a successor of his own going forward, who might be rebuilding one of those empires. You have a fellow in Russia who is named Putin, and he originally comes from Kiev. Through his genealogy that shows up out of nowhere in about the 1850s as Putin. And the Putyanin was the first bloodline of the Ukraine and of Kiev, and they started a branch bloodline and dynasty in Moscow in about 1000 AD with Vladimir the Great Putyanin. And then in the 1600s, through intermarriage, you have a junior offshoot, just as the Plantagenets are a junior offshoot of the Anjou. As an example, another example, you have the Romanovs through intermarriage taking over, and they're the ones that are wiped out at the beginning of World War I in this war of rivals. And the Western bloodlines always thought that the Kievan bloodline was too pure, and so they were taking sort of a higher position and weren't cooperating, which was part of the rivalries that sort of went on. Now, Putin's name comes up in the 1850s, and there's a tradition in the Putyanin tradition of the Ukraine that if you had a child out of wedlock, you would make sure they're still part of the nobility, but not part of the inner royal family, and you couldn't take the full name. And so, according to Putin and newspaper stories that were put out in the 2000s to create his mythos, whether this is true or not, this is what they put out. I mean, people can judge for themselves. And that he also honors Vladimir the Great with a statue that he has in Moscow. So he seems to might be taken with his own mythos. But he believes, according to this line of thought, that he is an illegitimate son of the Putyanin dynasty. So that what he's trying to do is recreate the Romanov dynasty, as what he said with the interview with Tucker Carlson. And so he's not going to destroy Kiev because that's a holy city for him. But he wants Kiev. And he is dynastically inclined as well, you could say. And so what people like President Trump were saying, people like Putin continue to say, people like Xi continue to say, is it's not that we are against the New World Order, that I like to call the Nephilim World Order or the Nephilim World Order. They want a larger role in what the Western European bloodlines are trying to impose. And that's the wars and the rumors of war that's going to settle out into these 10 toes, 10 kings, 10 horns of the Seventh Empire. And it's going to be groups of nations, empires. So you're going to have 5 on each foot. I don't know whether you can read that allegory, that you can see it rising up with the alliance of India, China, Russia, Persia. But it looks like there's an alignment coming up, and I would probably expect Germany to go over there as well before it all shakes out, and probably out of need for energy, just as India has that same requirement. And if that alliance starts to sound familiar with how you trace nations from the Table of Nations, look for those groups of nations in Ezekiel 38 with the Gog War. Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech, and Meshech is the etymological root for the city of Moscow. Gog is understood as you take that back to Greek in the New Testament and Hebrew in the Old Testament, as an allegory for an end-time Antichrist-like figure. Not the Antichrist, but one of the wannabes, probably the one that Antichrist will use for his pedigree as his Armageddon, to deceive the world that he's going to bring in an age of peace after winning the counterfeit Armageddon war. And Gog doesn't show up in the Table of Nations, but Magog does. Right? Which is really kind of interesting. But there's a parent god before the flood who bore giants. And interestingly enough, the 3 ones that are the most famous are Gog, Magog, and Albion. And giants of that name also show up after the flood in mythology, because it's typical to name giants after the flood from names before the flood. One other example might be Gilgamesh, as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or he inherits this mythos and his name changes to that, however you want to get there. But this is 6th generation after the flood. He's the son of Lugalbanda, king of Uruk, and the mother goddess Nin. But in Enoch Book of Giants, there's a Gilgamesh before the flood. So that happens. And Gog is a common name for part of these Gyges kings of the Herculides after the flood as well. I cover all of this off in book 2 if people are interested in a lot more detail. So I think we're seeing perhaps a group that is establishing their own banking system, their own credit card system, their own currency system, and their own alliance that's going to stand against the Western alliance that uses the U.S. as their attack dog. And Trump opposes that. And there's a price to do that if you want me to continue to do that. So it's not like I dislike a lot of things that Trump does, but I recognize he just wants a larger role. And I find that suspicious.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting way of summing it up. You covered a great amount of territory there. And one thing I want to get back to, obviously, people who are listening who are struggling to keep up get the books. I was tracking the stuff from book 1. You started getting into book 2, and I went, I'm going to have to get this book because I can't keep up with the speed that you were going, but I'm getting the broad strokes of it.
Sorry.
I want to get back. No, it's great. It's great. I want to get back to Eden, and for one selfish reason is that I'm in a sermon series and preaching on Eden, and the more I look at it, the more difficult it is. And also, I think it makes sense to go back to Eden because, given what you're saying, and I'm summarizing a couple of ideas here. You're talking about these mixed things that happened early on, and you talked about corruption. And I want to remind our audience that biblically, corruption is forbidden mixture. And you even got to that with the 10 toes. So we have this forbidden mixture that has happened and has affected the earth before the flood, after the flood, and can be traced all the way into a lot of the geopolitics of today with the divine right to rule and the ruling class. But it came from somewhere. It came from this pre-Adamic conflict. So let's go back to where Genesis 1:26, where Elohim is talking presumably to the Elohim and saying, let us make man in our image and let's give him dominion. And I want to ask this broad question of what was he making? What was it understood to be when he made mankind, Adam? And why is the dominion of the earth such a big deal when presumably you could have dominions of all kinds of things? And so what was happening there on a cosmic or on a celestial level? What were they understanding was going on when he said, hey, I've reorganized this thing, and I've reorganized this earth, and I've created it, and I'm going to make this new thing in our image, and it's going to be man, and he's going to be of the substance of this. And then if you want to get it real interesting, I'm going to create this garden thing, whatever Eden is, and I'm going to put him in it. And everything, we know kind of spirals from there. Yep. How do we need to be thinking about this? Because the term I'm using more and more, and I don't mean it derogatively, but I think people are picking up on this, the oversimplified concept, the flannel board concept doesn't make any sense given what you're describing. And I think there's probably a larger concept we need to step into that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. So typically, the Bible is written pretty much on a linear basis, almost sequential. Now, there are some books that are out of place, as let's say with the Book of the Prophets, but you get markers in there that takes you back to where it would fit into the history. And Revelation is written in the same sort of way, that it's in a linear sort of nature if you just let it flow. So it's interesting that you have the creation of the people on day 6, and then you have information that's provided with the Adam and the Adamites afterwards in Genesis 2. But the Bible has an MO of adding additional information as it goes, but with a caveat. It's never in contradiction to what it has said elsewhere, which gets to be interesting because the first thing you sort of notice in day 6 is that male and female are created at the same time and told to spread around the earth and multiply in great numbers. And people will say, well, that happens after Eden. And after the ostracization, but you're not told there's a fall there, but that's just one little detail. But they're not created at the same time in Eden. Adam is created in singular; they're not created in plural. There's multiple people being created in day 6. Eve is created sometime later, not at the same time, and from Adam's rib. They're told to spread out around the world, but Adam and Eve are put in the Garden of Eden. And they're described in day 6 as almost like hunters and gatherers, not agrarians as what Adam and Eve are. You have, as you mentioned, Elohim introduced, even though you have the spirit Ruach in Genesis 1:2 as being there, but you don't have the word there yet, people think. And so it's all grouped into Elohim, and they're either having conversations between themselves or something, but doesn't really make sense because they kind of act as one, and the Ruach is thrown separately there. So they're not having a conversation. So the New Testament tells us that the Word created all things, both in John 1 and Colossians 1. And that, so when one sort of says, well, what's that word said in Genesis 1? That's the Hebrew word amar, as in spoke. That's the word of God. And so Elohim can be understood, and you have to sort of take it back to the Hebrew and understand the context. Elohim can be singular in nature, even though it's the plural of El, if it's in the uppercase and it's referring to El Elyon, God Most High. And so you have the word there as in the words of God. So the world is created by the word at God's command, and the Spirit is there because it's going to add the spirit of life into everything. And so you have all three there, but you have a different usage of words as you get into Genesis 2. You have Lord God that's introduced not at the beginning of 2:1, but at 2:4, where it's Elohim before that. And again, that's kind of odd, but most people just say, okay, well, they're just sort of using both or whatever. But also, this doesn't say it's day 6 in there, in this creation, and it doesn't say it's day 8 anywhere. So we have no idea if it's not the same when this happens with Eden. And so Lord God is Jehovah Elohim.
That's important to me if you look at my first name. So Jehovah Elohim is Yoel.
Yeah, exactly. And the old, modern sort of Jehovah in Hebrew from the old tetragram and vowelless Hebrew Yahweh, or the V and the W changed its sound in terms of how we understand that today. So why would you have Jehovah Elohim there and not Ruach there? Your Ruach doesn't show up anywhere there. So there's something different that's going on here. So what is this Jehovah Elohim? I would understand that as Jehovah of the Elohim, just as you would understand the word of God as Logos of Theos. And so the Logos of Theos would be equivalent to Jehovah Elohim. This is a specific intercession sometime later by the pre-existent Jesus that's going to create Adam in a different way, breathe his spirit into him to be the commission to resolve the angelic rebellion down the road. And so the people of day 6 tend to answer the question is, who did Cain marry when he goes to Nod? And why was there a place named Nod? And why would he build a city if there was nobody there? And who is he afraid of? And people say, well, it's the brothers and sisters that were populating the earth of Cain. Well, Seth isn't born till when Adam is 130 years. And we don't know how long Adam and Eve were actually in Eden, but it doesn't look like a long time by the inference before the fall. And that when Cain, so let's say that's 40 years, whatever. We'll just say 40 years a generation on the lower level. And you could use a larger number if you want, doesn't matter, unless you get crazy with it. And then you have at the adult level when, and in Israelite law, and it would be the same for Adam and Eve, that you begin adulthood at around 20 and complete at around 40. So you would start to do some of the adult things. And this was their first offering, the first fruits. Except that Cain didn't offer the first fruits, whereas Abel did, and that's why his offering isn't rejected. So let's say that he was 40 years old. So now you're at about 80 years. And then he leaves and immediately finds a wife. Well, Seth is born at 130 years old, but there's no daughters and sisters born yet. And all we're told is sometime later, daughters and sisters were born. Mm-hmm. So you get into this sort of conundrum. And I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself. And these are contradictions, not additions of information. It's the details are different. Even the order of creation seems to be different in Genesis 2, as it's described. So
there's another great conundrum in there is when Adam is charged with cultivating and keeping the garden, and keeping it presumes protecting it. It's a protective word. He's protecting it. And I have written in my margin there, from what?
From who? Yeah,
From
exactly.
whom? What's he protecting?
I mean, if you really use critical analysis to the wording all the way through, you get a lot of questions, which is why I created a couple documents for people, and how I talk about day 6 people in book 1 as a different group of people than the Adamites that were created before. Now, if you look at the angelic rebellion, by the time Eden happens, obviously the rebellion has taken place, because at least with Satan. But if there is an older period, and if you look at 2 Peter 3 again that we talked about, where they describe a year as a day as 1,000 years for humans compared to God, then you could have 1,000 years that are being separated by those days. So you get even more time. And again, we don't know when Eden was. So if you look at Genesis 3:15, where the Nahash is a beast of the field, created in the chronology in days 1 through 6 on day 6, but sometime before Adam, the word Adam for humans, because it's the same species of both. They may be a different color or race, but they're the same species in the creation with a different commission. That you have this beast of the field that might be created first on in day 6, and that the humans are created in plural afterwards, and that the Nahash not only means serpent, but as you take that back to Nahash, its source word, it is a necromancer and a sorcerer.
It's a very complex word. It's very hard to follow what it is. It's part reptilian, part shining, part divine being. There's a lot going on there.
A walking, talking, intelligent being.
Yeah, and I made the point recently when, and I'm speculating, said, okay, so Adam is given dominion, and then there's no companion found for him. Yet you have something else that was
there was no suitable
companion.
So which is another big question.
And somebody
like, what are they looking at if they're not looking at day 6 people? Monkeys?
That's right. Yeah,
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's far more complex, and there's a lot more. There's a lot more going on here.
And then if you look at 2 Peter 3, not only is it talking about a day being for humans 1,000 years, but it's talking about this earth that perished. Well, the earth didn't perish in the flood. So when it's talking about the world that was in the water, that was out of the water, that's in the water, or the whatever use of the 3 different words of the water there are, I may not have quite quoted it accurately, but something else is going on there. And in day 6, what we learn, or in the days 1 through 6, is what we learn, that God separates the water of below into the waters of above to create the firmament, so that life can be renewed on the earth, just as Psalms 104 says, when and at the same time is describing the creation of the angels and other creation events, that when God sends his spirit, the earth is renewed. Well, that's kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And that if the rebellion happened before Eden and the earth was renewed, that means there might have been a destruction sometime before. And if the people that were created on day 6 and before Adam were under the overlordship of the fallen angels, just as we are, that they would have led all of those people astray, just as they led the Nahash astray. And then if that rebellion happened even before, as the gap theory people talk about, it would be between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And how they get there is that the word was void and formless. That's the Hebrew word haya. And you can translate that as was or became. Well, that's kind of interesting. And haya is the root word for Yahweh as well, or Jehovah. And so it either is, or it was, or it became, depending on how you want to look at that. And then you look at the word tuhu and buhu in Hebrew for void and formless, and it's inferring a destruction of some sort.
Yeah, I've spoken on this in the. I think that's it appears that it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now, where our story begins, we're coming upon this wasted earth that's
Yep.
in chaos and
Yeah.
destruction, and we see Yahweh begins to restore and reorganize it, and so the gap theory type concept always made a lot of sense to me. That it seems like a lot happened before we get to Genesis 1-2.
Yeah. So when you start to look at that even a little bit closer again, and I mean, I did a 3.5 hour presentation at a conference on it, so you could go really deep, but I won't. I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. And I do have a document, 2 documents I tend to share on it with people if they want to get a hold of me. So that if the world somehow became that way, then that would infer some sort of destruction. That would be a nice fit for where the angelic rebellion came from. Whereas in the accounts out of polytheism, it talks about angelic technology and the wars of the gods that had planet destroying capability.
Vedas have a lot of this. You get to the Vedas and some of these very, very old documents that talk about these cosmic conflicts that were unbelievably destructive and divine.
So back to 2 Peter 3. And it's talking about that the world that perished and was destroyed in fire, that's reserved for the end time. Nothing new is under the sun. What was will be again. And that there was this early destruction that destroyed the earth by fire that were not talked about. And it's not the flood because the flood didn't destroy it. So if you had this angelic war and you destroyed the earth and destroyed it down to the foundations, as you would lead into some passages out of Job and elsewhere in Psalms 104, that if you were going to renew the earth, or if you had that kind of destruction, then the waters above would collapse into the chaos. And then if you wanted to renew the earth as part of that process, you'd have to separate those waters to create the firmament again. And so things sort of kind of start to fall in place on that.
I want to clarify why a lot of people don't pick up on this. The separation of the waters in ancient Hebrew cosmology, the firmament is not the sky. And I hear people say that a lot, but you have the water separation is way up here, and then you have heaven, and then you have the stars, and then you have earth, and then you have Sheol. So it's a some, you know, there sometimes people think, oh, well, they just thought the sky was a dome of water. And it's a much more complex picture than that.
Complex than that.
And it's a much more divine
include picture. What science would call the ether as well, right?
Yes.
So
it's not just there's water vapor in the atmosphere and therefore we're all agreeing. It's a little more complex.
And I'll get there for people to really sort of understand this sort of thing. So we get a passage in Exodus 20:18 that talks about God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, and he created the heaven and the earth. So everybody says, well, that just destroys the gap theory. And yeah, but if you look at that word heaven, Shema, it's not in the singular form of Shema, but Shemaim, the plural form as it's used throughout the Bible, means that there's more than one heaven, right, in the application. Mm-hmm. And so heaven is defined as what's under the firmament, as what's outside the firmament, and the being where God lives. So there's 3 heavens. So let's now look at days 1 through 6. When he creates the firmament, it's called heaven. So that matches perfectly with Exodus 20 and a renewal. It's not in contradiction if you wanted to look at that. I'm not doctrinal on this. I just think it makes things fit better so that after the renewal of the earth on day 6, the fallen angels do what they did before. They led and corrupted the whole world before and led the people of day 6 and the Nahash astray. God creates the Adamites for a new commission that is designed to ensure humankind reads their destiny to be raised above angels through the resurrection and to judge those fallen angels for the crimes against humanity and against creation, and to be the inheritors of inheritance that will be administered to by the loyal angels.
There's
So it's our raison d'etre.
Yeah.
Why we were created.
Yes. It's well, I'm also there's a lot I want to ask, but I'm recognizing we're 94 minutes in as well on the recording. So I'd like to ask one more thing, if just because I'm curious what you have to say about it, and then Dan, if you have a final question. Gary's been great with his time here. What do you think about Eden as a place? So when I'm looking at Eden and I'm looking at the description of Eden in Genesis 2, then it says, well, God planted a garden, and we have our English version, and I'm not down, we got to translate it into something. It says he planted it in the east, and then you start doing words. Well, that it could mean the east, it could mean in antiquity, same word. So it's confusing. And then it starts describing, and a garden is by almost definition, it's walled. And then it talks about there's a river originating in Eden, and it's flowing into four, and then the English word is often for rivers, but it's not rivers. It's the same word as for mountaintops and the top of the Tower of Babel, and it's like heads or peaks. It's and people say, oh well, that's just headwaters. Yeah. Okay, but then you get these rivers described as flowing circuitously around lands. At least the first two of them. Yeah. The word for how they flow is completely different from the other ones. So tell me where.
When you take the rivers, I think it's a place. And when you take two of the rivers back that we can trace is the Euphrates and the Nile, as you take that back into the Hebrew. The other ones seem to be flowing elsewhere and away from the Mount Hermon area, maybe to the north, and maybe they're talking about the Jordan River. We don't know. It's really hard to make, but we do have sort of the bookends there of the dimensions. So, and ancient as in east, Olam, just as Elam is based on the same word as giants of old. I'll talk about that in book 2 as well. So I think it was a place. I think it was at Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a holy mountain. Its name's been changed to represent the curse of Haram, anathema that was carried out there. And Haram, Charm, can mean devotion and cursed in its various forms in Hebrew. And so we know that in the Ugaritic text, Mount Hermon was called Saphon. We know in the Bible it was called Sirion, Sinir, Sion, and also Hermon, which is rooted in Haram. And so that's also a plural word there, which is kind of interesting as well. So there might be more than one cursed mountain, right? Yeah. So I think we have enough to suggest that it would be there. Some people think it was in heaven, and people say, well, why can't we find it today? Well, after the ostracization, you had cherubim that were protecting it, but you also had a flood at some point in time that would have, wiped that out completely. And so when we look at that land as is talked about in the book of Genesis after the flood, that Israel is going to come into as the land of milk and honey, and it's God's land. In Eden, which would measure up perfectly, why he has the same dimensions, at least east and west, with the Nile and the Euphrates, as is promised to Abraham in Genesis 15, and that not only was it a land of milk and honey, Sodom and Gomorrah was probably the most fertile area of it before it was destroyed. And that in the time of Moses, they were taking out these huge grapes and bundles of grapes, and as examples of how plentiful it was. It sounds Eden-like to me. And so I'm pretty much comfortable that the reason why we don't know where it didn't go to heaven. It didn't go into another dimension. It's still there. It's just that we had a flood, and that whole world was wiped out.
Very interesting. Dan, I want to give you a chance for any final thoughts or questions, and before we break off here and hopefully come back to the conversation at some point. Gary Wayne, has been a lot of fun, and it's there's everything you say. I'm like, I have questions. But we have long format, but not eternal.
It only presents more doors to open up to go through. It never stops. You get through that, and it's like, oh, I got all these other questions, and
I feel like listeners are going to be mad at us for all the questions we didn't ask.
Of course.
They can get their money back.
Yeah. So I just one final thought is just as I listen to all this stuff, and your mind starts spinning, and you look at like you're saying, there's these powerful families who are bent on destruction of the world, and we know there are powerful entities, enemies of God, that want to destroy people and destroy our souls, and you look around at what's going on in the world today. I've listened to a podcast with Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson recently, and they were just talking about all this corruption and how the corruption is so blatant and in your face, and it's like they're corrupt, and they're basically saying, yeah, we're corrupt. What are you going to do about it?
Exactly. Yep.
And so it can be discouraging. Like I remember, they didn't have any answers for it. And so I just want to encourage you, like, as you're wrestling with all this stuff and your mind is probably spinning and going all these different directions, to take it back to Christ, right? Because, like, what do you do with all this information? I mean, hopefully the response is fall on your knees before Jesus, go back to the Bible, take it seriously, understand that Jesus knew. He wasn't speculating on this stuff. He knew everything that was going on, everything that was going to be going on. And his answer was, he gave us the Great Commission to tell us to go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey. And he told us what the greatest commandment was, and how loving God and loving your neighbor sums up all the law and the prophets. And so that was his focus, to bring us back to loving Christ and loving others. So I would challenge you as you watch or listen to this and have your mind going all those different ways, to bring it back to Christ, because it's all going to be reconciled in Christ eventually.
It has to be.
So that's where you want to be, is where it's going to be reconciled to. But it's better to be there voluntarily, because every knee will bow and every tongue will confess eventually. So
and to start to put more of the armor of God on, in case we are in the fig tree generation, and every generation should prepare that they might be.
We got to be ready.
We have to be ready, and that we can't count on the modern churches to prepare us. In fact, they're not preparing us. They don't teach prophecy, and they don't teach prehistory. They only take selective parts of the most preternatural book that was ever written and apply it. They teach good principles, but we need the context. We need to know the reason of our being, and we need to understand that we can't even begin to imagine what might be coming at us if it's going to be truly like the days of Noah that he warned us from, that even the elect will be deceived. He warned that, and that the only thing he promises us is to save us from the wrath, the year of the Lord's wrath, and the time or the hour of a trial or temptation, depending on which Bible translation that you're reading there. And there's an hour that is very specific, that is centered around the mark of the beast, the rise of Antichrist to power with that hour in Revelation 17, the hour that Jesus comes back. It's all the same Hebrew word, and the hour that Babylon is destroyed as the first part of Antichrist's reign of the 3.5 years to replace with his other religion. So no matter what, we're going to go through tribulation if we're in the fig tree generation, and all Christians are said to prepare to go through tribulation. It's just part of, you choose this, you will go through tribulation, but the rewards will be there. And hopefully, and what I felt, when I first started to learn about this stuff, first, you have this sort of cognizant dissonance, and then you say, well, what am I supposed to do with all of this? But I found more peace in understanding how the world works and where we're going, and found that if we're all given gifts, and if we're all given a thing that we're brought here to do, and I think we all are, my role is to try and connect dots for people and tell them about how, tell people more, or explain to more people about how the world works, so that these deceptions that are coming aren't going to lead you away, because in that time of tribulation, people within the church are going to be turning against each other, as Jesus instructed us. That takes a lot, to be turning each other in for persecution and death. So we need to understand what the Bible is talking about. And if you're looking at prophecy, I get it when everybody says, how can I rely on prophecy when there's all these different approaches and they all have different conclusions? And I agree, because it was so confusing for me. Well, my epiphany is it has to be simple. That if you put everything around what Jesus said, it has to fit. Everything fits. You don't define what Jesus said by what the prophet said. You define what the prophet said based on what Jesus said, when it particularly comes to prophecy or any sort of doctrine. And people say, well, you can't put revelation around on what Jesus said. And I'm going, well, why is that? Well, there's no chronology to it. There's no pattern to it. There's all of this allegory. And I said, well, I tend to tell people, well, we're told right at the beginning that this is the testimony of Jesus Christ given to an angel to show in a vision to John. It has to fit with what he said in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17 and 21. And the chronology has to be the same. And it is. And in book 2, I'll show a little bit of that and some of the other disciplines I try and use. And I'm not there to say I know everything. I'm saying if you want to take away the conflicts, that's what you need to do. The Bible, even prophecy, does not conflict. If you want to see the whole picture, you can't ignore inconvenient passages, as all of the traditional sort of approaches try and do. So I'm not a prophet. I'm not a minister. I did not go to theological school. I don't believe that I'm going to be shown prophecy or anything like that. I see patterns. I have a gift, and I'm a contrarian. So I like to verify things myself. And that puts me at odds with standard doctrine all the time, because I'm going to say, well, you have to include this passage. You can't ignore it. And so what they try and do if they're not ignoring it, then they try to reimagine what it says, just like they'll try and reinvent what Jesus said. So don't let people tell you that he didn't put his oration in chronological order. And I'm just going to finish up on that. So he uses the word then. That's the Greek word toda. That is the when. That is the then. There's no difference between our understanding in English as it was in the original Greek. And he gives you an exact order of chronology with the abomination at the midpoint, and then tells you to go read Daniel to get better understanding of those last 7 years that he's telling us about. And then if you look at separating out the 7 churches, that's kind of like one thing I explained in book 2 is a dual prophecy. So those dual prophecies provide something like information like say in Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28 that happened in prehistory, has events applicable for the time of the prophet, so in this case John, and for the end time. Some things aren't fulfilled. And you see that in those dual prophecies. Ezekiel 28 is as I said, Isaiah 14, and you have Jeremiah 51. You have several of these prophecies, and I give some of those examples in book 2, more examples than that. And they're all written in the same sort of way. And then if you look at after that whole understanding of the throne and the justification and testimony of who Jesus is again, you have the opening of the seals with 25% destruction. And that happens towards the start of the last 7 years that Daniel 9:27 tells us about, which Revelation works around 7 years, 3.5 years of the Antichrist reign, 3.5 years of the 2 witnesses and the 144,000. So Revelation 6 to 14 is going to give you the first 3.5 years. And we know that by the resurrection sequence of the first fruits that ends with the 144,000 first fruits and the 2 witnesses at the midpoint of the last 7 years in heaven. And then you have the angel that's going to preach the last of the gospel. So before the end comes, which is the last 3.5 years, you have to have a complete preaching of the gospel, not only by the church, not only by the testimony of the saints, but the 2 witnesses and the 144,000. That will also likely wake up the lost tribes of Israel in preparation for the days of Jehovah's visitations, as Hosea 9:7 talks about. And then at the midpoint of Revelation 14, after the angel preaches, then you get a summary of the last 3.5 years. The first destruction or event, major event, is the destruction of Babylon. And it gives you, in chronological order, the next set of major events. And then between Revelation 15 and 20, you get the details of those events. And then you get the millennium. And you have this word "and" that is used over and over and over and over. That's the Greek word ahi. It's the cognate word for tota, for the then. It is the next sequence, and it's the when, as it's used all the way through. And so even when you get into the little season, as a lot of people like to use in one type of eschatology, they like to sweep that away. And it's just happening in chronological order. And then they say something like, well, we're in this age of Tartarian deception, and it's the little season. And the only other application we have for a little season in the whole Bible, and it has 2 words there to make sure you understand the full context. It's not like 200 years or 300 years. It could be 3 months as a season, or it could be a small amount of a period of time. And the little season that we get, as the exact example happens in Revelation 6, where it's taking the martyred first fruits. Are told to wait for the other martyred first fruits for the testimony of Jesus come out of the tribulation of the saints, and they're told to wait for a little season. So the maximum you could expand that to, and the exact same 2 words, the maximum you could expand that to would be 3.5 years. So when that hour happens, when Antichrist comes to power, I think that little season is somewhere between, 3 months and maybe a few years when Satan is released. I don't think you need 3.5 years to round up armies from around the world. When they go to line the armies up at Armageddon, it doesn't take 200 years to do that. The demons just go out and they do the miracles and they show up in the last year. So I would say probably 3 months to a year is the likely meaning for a little season. So again, you can't leave out the inconvenient parts. Just let it flow. I mean, the Bible was created for us to understand. It's really quite simple. If you take it back to Greek and Hebrew, it can really open up some of the meanings, but you can basically get there without taking it back to Greek and Hebrew for like 99% of it. But I like to take it back to the original languages because I want the full context of the words and I want a little bit more understanding.
Yeah, especially when there's something that sticks out or is weird. That's when a word study gets really helpful, when you go, why does it say that?
There is some bad translations like unicorn in the KJV or Easter that comes from Pashka, which is the Greek word for Passover. And, people will say, well, of course, Easter is the right translation there. I'm going, but it's translated as Passover elsewhere in the New Testament. So why would that one word be singled out? Well, because the Jewish people after the crucifixion went completely polytheist. So they didn't celebrate any feasts of God? No. Well, then why in 12:3, because this happens in 12:4, were they celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread then? It's like how we get deceived into some of these things is absolutely crazy. But so there are some badly translated or dubious translations, but it doesn't make a large difference on the Bible. And each of the translations have some issues.
Well, Gary, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I was serious when I said I hope we can revisit it sometime. It's very helpful. I know our audience really appreciates this, and I want to make sure I thank you for being courageous enough and diligent enough to take the gifts that the Lord has given you and put them to work for Him. It would be easier to do nothing or something that gets a lot more applause from the world. And obviously you're capable of doing a lot of things, but to choose to take that and return it to him and say, Lord, how can you use this for your church, for the edification of your people? And I know your heart behind it is you want people to see it. You want people to hear it. You want it to be out there. And that's why you're working so hard.
Yeah, I want people to have the information so that they can make a decision for yourself. Whatever that decision is, I hope it leads you back to Christ or takes some of the edges off your faith issues. But it's there for people to make their own choice, because no decision is a decision. And Jesus makes that perfectly clear, that you're neither hot nor cold, and I will spit you out. So learn about it, put on the armor of God, make your choice.
Yeah. And you can do it in the other order. You can put on the armor of God and then go learn about it if you need to. So,
absolutely. Get there.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gary. We really appreciate your time, appreciate your scholarship and all the hard work you've put into this. And thank you for the couple of hours that you've given to us and our audience. I know our audience will have a great time with this. We have a discussion forum for those of you who are listening to the podcast or watching this on YouTube. You can go to our YouTube channel, and there is a link to our Telegram discussion forum, and where people ask questions and speculate and kick things around and post stuff, and it's good. And people are generally very friendly there. So for those of you who want to discuss this, that's a good place to go. Yep. Gary, thanks for joining us.
Can I do a little bit of shameless self-promotion?
Yes. Thank you very much for the reminder. I meant to do that, and my
no
brain's fried at the end. And also, I want to make sure, and I'll send you a note afterwards, but make sure you send me links to anything, because we'll include it in all the show notes and in all the descriptions, and we'll post them so that everybody can find it. So tell everybody where to find you, where to get part 2 of Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and whatever else you have going on. And thanks for letting me not miss that. I would have kicked myself if I had forgotten.
Hey, no worries. So the best way to get a hold of me is through my website. That's the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the number 6conspiracy.com. On that website, there is a contact the author. So if I mention some documents, like Day 6 versus Eden, or the renewal of the earth, or if you have a question you'd like to get more information on, ask me. I have a document on that topic. So if you're asking a topic, ask by a generic topic. If I have a document, I'll send that off to you. It might take me a couple months to get back to you, but I will get back to you to answer the question or to send you the documents. I do that at no charge. So if you want to know more about my book, I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters of book 1 and all 84 chapters of book 2 on the website. And the information never stops coming at you in either of the books. And like I say, book 2 is going to challenge Christians in a way that they haven't been challenged before, but in a good way of exploration and understanding the Old Testament and prophecy in a rather unique way. And that if you think that by reading the generous excerpt, you're going to get all the information, it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, there's so much information in my books. You could talk for almost, in hyperbole, almost for forever on the information that's in there. So if you like what I'm talking about, and you want to support me, I don't take donations. You buy my book. But you don't have to support me to do that. Just spread the information. That's the biggest thing is what I want. But if you decide you want to support me, you can buy my book. So you could get a signed copy. I mail all over the world. I live in Canada. And there's a book 1, a buy now page for book 1 and for book 2. And so you go to either one and you go to wherever you live in the world. So I have a page for Canada, I have a page for the US, and then I have a page for the rest of the world. So go to, if you're in New Zealand or if you're in France, you go to international and I'll mail you a book. You can also link over to Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, and BarnesandNoble.com to buy a book from them as well. And it's also available. Both books are available in Kindle version on Amazon, and Amazon has books on the way for book 2 for the UK, for Australia, and other places around the world. So it's just starting to trickle out there. Canada just got their books. The book was released on March 12th, but Canada's a long ways away from the US apparently. So just tongue in cheek there. It's interesting how the publishing system works. And there will be an audio version that will be coming out later this summer for both book 1 and book 2 that I will also put links up to when that comes out. That'll be available through Amazon. So that's the best way to get a hold of me. And Kindle version, I recommend a Kindle version for everybody, even if they have a written book. I use Kindle on my books just to find stuff quickly because there's just so much information in there. So, yeah, that's the best way to get a hold of me is through my website.
Terrific. Do you have any? I also want to mention Dan's going to do a mime version of book 2, and that'll be going out and hitting theaters probably later this summer. So, Gary, do you have any speaking engagements or anything coming up? Any appearances that people should be aware of?
Not on the short term. I had 4 opportunities for June, and I can't do June at all this year, so I had to turn down 4 conferences. I am working on confirmation for ones in October and November. They're not officially completed yet in terms of that, they're going forward, but I've made myself available for 3 or 4 through there, and I hope those come through because I haven't done any yet this year. And it was just unfortunate I can't do them in May because they were all ones I wanted to go to.
Yeah. Well, keep us posted, and I know our audience will be keeping an eye on these things, and I will link to as much of that as I can, but it sounds like the Gen 6 Conspiracy website is the main site here. And I do encourage everybody in the audience, by the way, part of the function of this platform is to make sure that thoughtful information becomes available. And so we don't ask for anything on the podcast. Dan and I do this for fun, and it is a great deal of fun. But we do ask that you support the people that come on and share their time and their expertise. Do go buy the books, and we think that that's a very meaningful way of showing people, hey, we appreciate what you're doing. And if you buy the book and read it, even better, or give it to somebody who will read it, and that's a good place to go. So thanks very much, Gary Wayne. We've had a great time. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mystery Babylon audience, for joining us. Thanks, Dan, for helping us host this episode. And everybody, we look forward to the next episode.